Firstly, thank you, of course, very much, Oliver, for that extremely kind introduction. Though you have robbed me of one of my trademark phrases. Ordinarily, when I come to functions such as this, people get a copy of my bio note, they read it verbatim, and then they say very nice things about me, and I have to get up and say thank you very much for those kind words. I wrote them myself. But in this case, Oliver actually came up with his own introduction and has actually just been genuinely very kind. And so I'd like to start by acknowledging, of course, the New Zealand Initiative for having me here this evening, and I'm very grateful for them bringing me out to New Zealand, and also to acknowledge the hard work they do, but also to acknowledge the very hard work and success of you, Oliver, as the head of the New Zealand Initiative. As you're all aware, of course, the legacy of the New Zealand Initiative's predecessor organisations, the Business Roundtable and its leader Roger Kerr, and the New Zealand Institute, had an enormously positive contribution towards this country over many years. So in that context, Oliver, you have very big shoes to fill now being in charge of the New Zealand Initiative. But you are also missed very much in Australia. While I am a prolific commentator in public debate, although I have to be a bit more reserved these days, sadly in my new role, Oliver, I'd say, if anybody was my competition, was definitely my competition. In particular, he was always of great value. To turn on the ABC, and that's the point where, do people know the ABC in Australia? Yes. You can make up your own judgments. Of course, I appear on it regularly, so of course I think they're wonderful. But there are many mornings you'd wake up and turn on the ABC, and there'd be some recent event related to the European debt crisis, and there would be Oliver talking about it from somebody who had lived experience and lived European experience, to remind Australians about why there were issues with the European model, how if we weren't aware of the issues that existed around debt, that they could be repeated in Australia, and that maybe the best thing isn't just to blindly follow the European path. I think it'd be fair to say that we missed that contribution in Oliver, in you contributing in public debate, Oliver, so I'm sure at some point you may come back, although I do know you have really adopted your new home of New Zealand and seem to be very happy here, so you guys may be the winners. I should also acknowledge, who's just arrived, my, compatriot, fellow commissioner, the New Zealand Human Rights Commissioner, David Rutherford. I'm going to make a series of potentially controversial remarks tonight, but one of the things that's been really interesting in the human rights space since starting in this role and working in it formally is that while I have some despondency around how some of the discussion around human rights is conducted in different countries, and including in Australia, I have to say I found David in particular to be somebody who's been a very good source and contact point to talk about these issues, and who seems to have a very good idea about some of the great challenges we face in talking about human rights. That doesn't mean he agrees with me, and I don't always look for people to agree with me, but he does understand the complexities and understands how talking about basic freedoms and basic rights has to be back at the centre of discussions around human rights for it to have credibility and to so connect with the average person in New Zealand or Australia. So David, I really appreciate you coming here tonight and no doubt offering comment on what I have to say as a consequence. As some of you may be aware, late last year the newly elected Abbott government announced my appointment as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. I'm not sure how much attention it got here, and I really on one level hope it didn't get much attention at all. But in Australia there was certainly a wave of public discussion before Christmas about my appointment. Much of the discussion related to whether someone who believed in freer markets, a free society, and could be proudly in favour of individual liberal rights and responsibilities could also be a Human Rights Commissioner. Now, you can make your own judgments about that. To me, the public debate highlighted how distorted some of the discussion around human rights has become, some of it for good reasons, some of it for bad reasons. But arguing that human rights are the foundation of classical liberal thought and freedom has actually become somewhat controversial. When announcing my appointment late last year, the Attorney-General, George Brandis, noted that there was an absence of a rights-based culture, or at least discussion, in Australia, and he actually asked me to focus on advancing rights and freedoms, which is probably what I would have done anyway, but it's nice to have at least been asked, particularly in liberal human rights, such as freedom of speech. Resulting from my classical liberal approach to human rights and views about greater freedom for the individual, the Attorney General, as Oliver already pointed out, dubbed me the Freedom Commissioner, and I can give you absolute confidence that that is precisely what I plan to be and am doing. I want to advance rights and freedoms with complementary responsibilities. In Australia, the focus on freedom and political discourse has been represented as, quote, the freedom wars. Now, some people have chosen to misinterpret that as though it's some sort of Tea Party-ish import out of the United States, where in fact I look at it and say, if you keep regulating people's lives and legislating people's lives, what they can do with themselves, with their property and their activity, at some point there is going to be pushback and people are going to stand up for their freedoms. To me, defending freedom is merely the evolution of past intellectual debates about the relationship of the individual to the state. And at the heart of that is human rights, around the rights of the individual and their dignity. Defending human rights and freedoms is particularly problematic, of course, in our countries, like Australia and New Zealand, because we have utilitarian cultures. Now, while I recognise that New Zealand has its own unique traditions and is different from Australia, the origins of our societies were broadly not found in the same sorts of revolutions that faced the United Kingdom or the United States, who of course we have a very close relationship with. Instead, we transplanted their traditions without their revolutionary fire. In 1985, British English law professor Hugh Collins wrote about the political culture of Australia in his important article, Political Ideology in Australia, the Distinctiveness of a Benthamite Society, and I'd recommend everybody go and read it. I realise, again, Australia is different, but a lot of the principles remain the same here. In his essay, Collins argued, what is meant by a Benthamite society? Simply that the dominant ideology of the society conforms to the essential character of Jeremy Bentham's political philosophy. And three aspects of Bentham's thought are crucial here: his utilitarianism, his legalism, and his positivism. Collins continued by arguing that Bentham's theory is equally hostile to doctrines of social contract. Although a theory of individual interests, it rejects the notion of natural rights, human rights, which was central in both the American and the French revolutions. His position is put succinctly: governments were instituted not because man had rights, but because he had none. In an ideology faithful to Bentham's system, natural rights will be an alien tradition. The rationalist assumption of Bentham's philosophy signals an approach to politics that is both secular and instrumental. There is no deistic basis for religious exceptionalism. Political institutions are mere human contrivances. They're not divinely ordained. The expectations are mundane and unheroic. There is neither a messianic mission nor a return to a classical ideal. Utility imposes its own discipline upon reality and sets its own limits to imagination. Now, as I said before, I recommend people go and read Collins's insights because it actually very accurately describes the type of societies that we all live in: utilitarian societies. His argument is that despite significant intellectual and political events that have informed the development and nature of our inherited political traditions, in practice we operate pragmatically and on a largely legalistic basis. His article was written in the 1980s, and it foresaw the adoption of more robust and principled political philosophies and how those tensions may also emerge. But it ignores the nature of how you convince people in our society for change. Appealing to rights rarely works in political discourse. In Australia, as in New Zealand, and I've had this backed up by a few people now, appealing to concepts of fairness is actually much more effective than appealing to the idea of rights. In fact, there was a whole book written just on freedom versus fairness that compares US and New Zealand political traditions and why they are different. And going back to Collins, his analysis raises many questions, if that is to be true, and I believe it is, for how you then seek to advance liberal human rights and freedoms in utilitarian cultures. We have common law rights in theory, but in practice, so long as the legislature writes laws specifically enough, they can be trounced by politicians as they see fit. Yet the whole concept of rights is for them to be a nuisance to politicians and governments seeking to advance progressive causes. The same broad principles also, of course, apply with statutory human rights acts. Our cultures need to be able to survive beyond the idea of these utilitarian concepts towards more rights-based arguments, and those are the things we need to appeal to. We need, in order to do this, to make human rights relevant to everyone. To do so, we need to press the reset button on discussing human rights and remind people that human rights are the foundation of our basic social, political, and economic liberties. And that's incredibly complex to do. We have to go back to the foundations of our society, and particularly when a lot of people who are human rights academics and the like are often not focused on those things and focus much more on discussion, invariably on partly how to deal with the balancing or competing of rights, which often means in how we constrain our freedoms, not on how we unleash them. We need to take the discussion about human rights back to their origins, and that's what I'll be doing for 5 years. Human rights are the foundational building blocks of our liberal democracy. Now, of course, we need to make a technical distinction. We talk about rights and freedoms interchangeably. Human rights and freedoms are not actually the same thing. Human rights, the protection of the individual against government encroachment, as well as the potential harm others do. But freedoms are about the exercise of those rights. And to that end, there are 4 foundational human rights that I will be arguing strongly for in my role, and Oliver's already outlined them. Freedom of association, religion, expression, and property rights. They are what I have dubbed the forgotten freedoms. Now, it probably seems odd to refer to freedoms we exercise on a daily basis as forgotten. But as foundational freedoms, they are being taken for granted. And as a consequence, when they go up against alternate, otherwise very worthy policy objectives, they are being consequently compromised. And of course, any compromise is rarely explicit, though sometimes they are. But more often than not, instead compromises occur through the incremental advancement of other worthy objectives which simply encroach on rights, but through utilitarian culture we say, that's fine, it's worth the price to pay. It's a universal human right, for instance, to freely associate with others, but it is a right very much under pressure in the face of government seeking to advance other goals. Some of the biggest restrictions on freedom of association, of course, come from anti-terrorism legislation, which we all agree has been introduced for absolutely sensible and logical ambitions to keep people safe. But in the process, it's not just the standards that have been adopted, which may need to be reviewed and have sunset clauses placed on them in order to make sure that they do not go on beyond the threat that exists. But also they establish precedents which are then replicated in other laws. And we've seen this a lot in Australia, where anti-terror laws are the basis of a lot of restrictions on even freedom to protest in state laws. Similarly, we have laws designed to tackle particular groups within our community that we do not like bikie gangs. I don't know if you guys have bikie gangs or not. You do? Oh, well, lucky you. But many states in Australia these days have anti-consorting laws designed to try and target bikie gangs, because we all recognise that people engaged with criminal activity should be held to account. But in the process, what we're actually doing is criminalising a basic human right, and more often than not, with the ambition of doing so to try and catch people for crimes that we cannot prove they have committed. It's a big problem. Similarly, practices that aid unions operating a no-ticket, no-start work environment are as much an encroachment on free association as government restrictions stopping people from not joining a trade union movement. And then, of course, there's the ongoing periodic discussion about whether university students should have to join their student unions. And then there are periodic efforts to get private associations to lose exemptions from anti-discrimination laws that allow them to have specific membership requirements. And the most notable one is gender-based requirements. Freedom of religion is also facing its equivalent challenges. Since starting in my role, I've met with representatives from many religious institutions around the country. One of their chief concerns is that the human right of religious worship will increasingly be narrowed to only cover activities on Sunday inside a house of worship. Now, while broader anti-discrimination objectives are not the same as human rights, and I'll say more about that later, they are one and the same when it comes to the human right of equality before the law. It's a human rights violation for the government to unjustifiably discriminate. But the line between religious practice and the necessity of the competing human rights of equality before the law is greyed significantly when governments outsource services to faith-based bodies and they take public money. Many religious faiths compete in a marketplace to provide these outsourced public services. And understandably, many Australians, and I'm sure the similar issues arise here, believe government non-discrimination standards should apply for all those services funded by the taxpayer. But in practice, that means that institutions like religious schools face a choice about whether they would rather close their doors than be told by the government how to exercise their faith. And that's a big problem, particularly in parts of Europe, where there have been increasing impositions on different religious faiths as a consequence, for instance, of adoption services and who they are allowed to adopt children to, and the government setting standards around that, and it being in conflict with their faith. And at the heart of these considerations for both government and faiths is the question of what religion is. Is it something practiced in a house of worship on Sunday? Or is it evidence in the practice of the exercise of everybody's individual freedom if they're religious? Where this line is drawn has a profound impact on the full realisation of this important human right. Arguably the most forgotten of all human rights is property. Of all the forgotten freedoms I talk about, property rights appears to be the one that attracts the most response. Yet, as I see it, it should be utterly uncontroversial. Even if you don't take approach of human rights from international declarations or treaties, as I don't, even those who do should acknowledge that Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to own property as well as in association with others, and that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. And of course, property rights are not just about physical property. Property rights are about people's ownership of their own bodies, the use of their physical property and land, and intellectual property. Property rights are not just about the importance of the security they provide. The freedom of exercising property rights undermines the entire structure of our market economy. It's the basis in which people raise and attract investment capital to grow economies. It's the basis of housing, which leads, of course, to the extent to which regulation then uses and limits what people can do with their physical property. It is, of course, the basis of economic growth in a market-based society. And you only need to see the full extent of what happens, for instance, in a country like China, where property is regularly confiscated, to have a full recognition of just how much encroachment on property rights is a human rights violation. I know that you have your own issues with property rights in this country at the moment as a consequence of the Christchurch earthquakes, which is a healthy reminder, and one I think the New Zealand Initiative should be taking advantage of, to highlight how important property rights are to a national discussion and the structures of your economy and your society. However, the most ambitious and most frontier and forward-looking component of property rights that faces the most challenge is in the personal domain. If people own their own bodies, then the question has to be asked, what role is there for the government to tell them what they can do with it? People's ownership of their own bodies poses really serious and difficult questions, and correspondingly really difficult answers about how we can end our own life and the degree of bodily autonomy we have to take risks and live with the consequences. Although by the extent to which you're prepared to throw yourselves out of planes and bungee jump, it suggests that maybe you've already started to think about some of these issues in the way we haven't. Freedom of opinion and expression provides the foundation for a free and democratic society, and it's integral to the enjoyment of the rights to freedom of assembly and association and the exercise of the right to vote. Free speech is an essential human right in a liberal democracy. It is the extension of the absolute human right of conscience and thought. Free political communication also underpins the principles of transparency and accountability that are, in turn, essential for the promotion and protection of human rights. Or more to the point, free speech is the human right we use to defend all other human rights. And of course, we are never called in to defend free speech from the excessive use of please and thank you. We are only ever called in to defend free speech when it crosses the line of social acceptability. And that is very problematic for those who seek to defend it and that important principle. Because the importance of free speech in liberal democracies was highlighted by the inclusion as the second subject of Sir Robert Menzies, our longest-serving Prime Minister's Forgotten People speeches. Menzies argued that so few of us have objective minds, detached minds, and what we may conceive to be the truth is very often coloured or distorted by our own passions or interests or prejudices. Hence, if truth is to emerge, and in the long run to be triumphant, the process of free debate, the untrammelled clash of opinion, must go on. Menzies continued in his speech by quoting John Stuart Mill and his seminal work, and I suspect a fair lick of the people here tonight have read it, On Liberty, and identified there is a speech that can, of course, cause significant harm and can be legitimately curtailed. Now, despite our two countries having relatively good track records on free speech, this does not mean we should be complacent. As already outlined, few threats to our freedoms come from deliberate curtailment. Instead, they come through incremental encroachments. The encroachments are often introduced with these good intentions to advance legitimate policy goals. And these are the sorts of issues that we're exploring at the moment in our current debate around the Racial Discrimination Act. And I'm not sure how much people have followed that or not, but it's certainly been one fiery one indeed. And under the Racial Discrimination Act, we have a section called 18C that makes it unlawful for a person to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person on the basis of their race. And the current government has sought to reform those laws. And they've done so because they place an unnecessary restriction on free speech because that is made unlawful simply to offend or insult somebody. I know you've had similar debates on these sorts of issues in the past in New Zealand, and in many ways they're never settled. So brace yourself, Mr. Commissioner. Not all encroachments are uncontroversial. Menzies identified, like Mills and many others who have written on the subject, that there are legitimate restrictions to free speech, and they of course exist when they come into conflict with other rights. For example, it is uncontroversial that people cannot use speech to imminently incite violence against other persons. But additional censorship of an unjustified kind simply for competing policy objectives that don't conflict with rights is not one of them. Censorship is not just an affront to the rights of the speaker, it is also an affront to the rights of the listener, to hear, to learn, to be challenged, to inform their own views, to support and of course to oppose. And in a liberal democracy, all speech is legal until it is made specifically illegal and not the other way around. Censorship also misdiagnoses the most effective method to directly tackle disharmony and prejudice within the community. It is not the end of the discussion. First, we have an incredibly large number of methods we use to normalise civil conduct. Codes of conduct that exist in the workplace around sporting teams and other civil society organisations are enormously important in making sure that people do the right thing and treat each other with respect. And they're not even always formalised. As I regularly point out, there are some words that I'm allowed to use at the pub, but I'm not allowed to use in front of my mother. But no one has ever written them down. The code, not the words. Second, as Human Rights Commissioner, it is my role as Human Rights Commissioner to defend the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex Australians. And that often requires speaking out against prejudice in all its forms. Yet, for instance, with our current Act, which imposes restrictions on the basis that somebody may be offended, insulted or humiliated on the basis of race, it actually makes it somewhat difficult to talk about culturally ingrained prejudice in different ethnic communities. Ironically, of course, our society's success in tackling things like homophobia provides food for thought in this debate about how we use more speech to tackle conduct that we deem to be unacceptable. And there have been a couple of recent examples in Australia. Last week, Opera Australia released Georgian opera singer Tamar Aviri from her contract for her upcoming commitments to perform in Othello. Opera Australia released Aviri from her contract following the exposure of deeply offensive and inflammatory remarks made about participants in Georgia's Gay Pride March. The comments were made in an open letter that was attributed to her on her Facebook page. According to the letter attributed to her, she was, quote, quite proud of the fact that Georgian society spat at the parade. The letter also said she was opposed to vigorous attempts to bring the West's fecal masses in the mentality of the people by means of propaganda, which basically means that homosexuality is an import from the West, which is actually a very standard argument used, particularly in African countries who want to use laws to penalise people who are gay. Unsurprisingly, many, particularly in the arts community, took exception to those arguments. Yet, even without legal restrictions, Aviri suffered the consequences of her derogatory views. Opera Australia simply used their human right of free association to distance themselves from her. That raised, of course, a number of issues around whether and the extent to which people should be able to penalise other people on the basis of their views argued publicly. But the key point is that people are able to use their human rights to set proper standards. It would also be an error to conclude that a public backlash only occurs in high-profile cases. We've seen similar examples recently in the Queensland town of Gladstone, in the Gladstone Observer, where a seemingly unknown and irrelevant letter to the editor by a woman by the name of Carol Zuno lamented, quote, another television show that appeared on our screens with a token homosexual character, ... forget the warm fuzzy propaganda, homosexuality is a sexual perversion. To the point where, of course, there were lots of letters in response to the letters page from local people, and it dragged a certain amount of national attention. To the point where the deputy editor of the Gladstone Observer, I don't know what its circulation is, but I don't think it's very high, had to in the end go out and defend themselves and say that they thought that they had to publish the letter because if it was not published, the Observer could be rightly accused of censorship. Of course, they're half right. It is not censorship for a newspaper to refuse to give offensive views a platform. It's actually just good judgment. But it is not illegal. And in response, there was a discussion from the gay and lesbian community about if it had been about a matter of race, it probably never would have been published in the first place, which is partly true because of the laws we have in place. But what is better, censorship or, as Justice Brandeis once argued, sunlight being the best disinfectant? So my focus is how do we use these freedoms and how do we use our liberties to maximise our freedoms in the process, and also by holding people to account. There are competing views, of course, about how human rights and freedoms should be approached. They are, after all, a political construct. And I've made it clear that I will be approaching human rights from a liberal approach, that human rights are the protection from the abuse of power by government against the individual, that people own their own lives and the pursuit of their opportunities and their enterprise, while of course ensuring they do no harm to others. Human rights are narrow and can be reasonably exercised consistently and rarely come into conflict, but importantly that rights underpin people's exercise of their freedoms. Since starting in this role and engaging with many people, one point is clear. There is a fundamental lack of understanding about what human rights are. Commentators can ascribe their own reasoning. My conclusion is the lack of understanding comes from human rights being disconnected from their foundational principles. It's entirely understandable that countries sought to internationalise human rights values after the Second World War through treaties. However, this process has disconnected human rights from their origins. Governments negotiated what human rights are. They are no longer seen as birthrights. They are now simply perceived as gifts of government. In fact, I saw an analysis recently which suggested if you calculated all of the different human rights and international treaties, there are now about 1,500 of them. As argued by Daniel Hannan in his book How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters, the internationalisation of human rights continentalised them away from the Anglosphere tradition. Hannan argues that while the contents of the various European and international human rights codes are generally unobjectionable, the elevation of such codes to the detriment of national sovereignty and parliamentary democracy is wholly at odds with the Anglosphere, or really our tradition. As a consequence, parliamentary democracies come second to international jurists who establish new standards and challenge the positions of democratically elected governments. And we saw this only recently when the European Court established a new human right called the right to be forgotten, which I find very difficult to rationalise a human right since A key part of exercising rights is being held to account for how you use them. So how can you be held to account on how you use them if you also have the right then to be forgotten about how you use them? But from a liberal perspective, the much broader challenge is reconnecting those human rights to their principled origins. Many of us equate human rights with civil and political rights. But as I've already outlined, they are the foundations of our free economy. They are the very foundation. The free economy is built on property rights, individual ownership of your own body that provides the foundations of your labour, physical property, which is the foundation of trade and investment, intellectual property, which is central to services and innovation. Approaching human rights this way probably for many people seems unnecessarily philosophical and anachronistic. But we should remember that the seemingly simple idea that individuals are born free with inalienable rights and the government's role is to preserve and protect these rights remains dauntingly revolutionary around the world. They evolved out of hundreds of years of events and thinking that arrived from Europe and the United States that have framed our liberal democratic traditions. It was only 799 years ago, about 15 days ago, that we saw the Magna Carta, or Great Charter of 1215, where King John had constraints on the power of the monarchy, egregious constraints on the power of the monarchy, and the recognition that at least nobility had rights. It was after that period, and through subsequent versions of the Magna Carta and liberal Enlightenment thinking, that universalised human rights for all people in the 17th century through great thinkers such as through John Stuart Mill and John Locke. These influences led to social, economic and legal framework that we all largely enjoy today, but take for granted. The rights and property guaranteed for Maori are infused in the Treaty of Waitangi. While Enlightenment thinking concluded everyone had foundational human rights, it was the 48 Universal Declaration of Human Rights that took these principles from Western liberal democracies and truly globalised them. The Declaration was built on FDR's 1941 State of Union address that prescribed a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first of Roosevelt's essential freedoms were speech and worship, and they came directly from the liberal tradition. But the third was freedom from want, meaning securing every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants. The fourth was freedom from fear, meaning that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbour. The latter two reflect, of course, the events of the day. Freedom from want reflects the politics of the Great Depression. Freedom from fear reflects the politics of the Second World War. And more importantly, these two freedoms are a departure from the traditional liberal approach to human rights. These two freedoms formally establish the idea that freedoms can exist without corresponding rights, that rights cease to be about individual autonomy, and that new rights could simply be added to the list. These ideas were then littered through the Universal Declaration and subsequent international human rights treaties. And the UN system that has continued to add these to the list have only resulted in diluting the integrity and sacrosanct nature of human rights. And it's in these treaties that the two very significant different human rights traditions were also infused. In his History of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Austrian human rights lawyer Manfred Novak wrote about how Articles 19 and 20, which are the ones that deal with freedom of thought and expression, perfectly demonstrate the tension that existed at the time between the socialist and the liberal traditions on human rights. According to Novak, in the liberal view, every individual has the freedom to form his or her own opinions free from external doctrination and to defend them in the free market of ideas, without fear of repression. The zone of legitimate state intervention commences at the point where the expression of an opinion interferes with the rights of others or constitutes an obvious direct threat to life and society. By comparison, he argued that according to the socialist view, human rights are, in general, the embodiment of the very essence of the socialist state, and are marked by an objective conformity of interests between the citizen and the socialist society freed of class antagonism. Now, that analysis, of course, is based on the rhetoric of the day when it was written. But the broad objective that Novak was outlining is that human rights, according to the socialist view, are to be interpreted as an instrument to ensure democratic participation, not protect the universal human rights of the individual. It's the basis in which there is much of focus of a progressive, politically progressive view of human rights today. Now, there's clearly an inconsistency between the liberal and the socialist traditions. Yet this tension continues to exist through the treaties and then as a consequence, in part, how laws are drawn up in our different countries. As new socialist human rights have been added to the liberal list, they of course conflicted with liberal rights, and this is where we've had to come up much more with the idea that we need to balance them, and that effectively undermines individual rights. Sometimes worthy civil rights and social justice aspirations have also been elevated to the sacrosanct status of human rights, and anti-discrimination has been conflated. I consider what I'm about to say to be uncontroversial, but in my discussions, at least in Australia, it is not. First, that civil rights are not the same as human rights. Civil rights are the gift of citizenship. Human rights are universal and exist from birth. Second, that social justice is not the same as human rights. Social justice is about advancing social and economic equity. Human rights are about uncompromisingly protecting the autonomy of the individual and their enterprise. Third, anti-discrimination is not a human right. Anti-discrimination is about removing unjust prejudice. Whereas, and I say this is a very important qualifier, apart from equality before the law, human rights are actually about exercising discrimination, such as free association, which is all about saying who I choose to associate with or not. Fourth, group rights cannot be human rights. Group rights cannot be universal to every person. Human rights can only exist for individuals. Now, the four objectives I've outlined are all broadly confused because of the development, as I've said, of international treaties and how they've sought to perpetuate what rights are in individual countries. This was a subject discussed in Richard Epstein's 1996 paper, kindly gifted to me by Bryce before I arrived here to give this lecture. The human rights paper was titled Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Legislation. It was written for the former New Zealand Business Roundtable in discussing the New Zealand Human Rights Act. According to Epstein's criticism of the New Zealand Human Rights Act, it did not give proper deference, recognising that all individuals are owners of their own selves and of their resources that they can acquire either through original possession or through contract and exchange with other individuals. There is nothing people care about which cannot fall under the class of either labour or property, including the crucial right to associate with other individuals. And this gives us a broad definition untroubled by the ambiguity of modern statutes. Epstein argues that such an approach guarantees a degree of formal equality. Formal equality will never guarantee perfect social equality. But it is a dangerous illusion to think we can guarantee social equality by statute which systemically violates the requirements of formal equality. Now, of course, people will have their own views on that matter, but I think he has some interesting insights. Of course, we should aspire to be a society that opposes unjust discrimination against people on the basis of irrelevant factors, such as race, age, gender and sexuality. We should do so because it's good for social cohesion, because it means that we can make sure that we can value people for their full capacity. Nobody can ever be their fullest selves if people seek to suppress a component of themselves. Of course, you could take the simple and straightforward economic argument that discrimination is inefficient and is actually bad for business, and I believe it is. But there is a big difference between government discriminating and individuals discriminating against each other. Outside of equality before the law, as I've already mentioned, prioritising anti-discrimination undermines the exercise of freedoms. The sole purpose of freedom of association is to associate with others, decide with some and not others. But there are also discriminatory functions to property rights and religious worship as well. Similarly, exercising human rights can be about establishing standards that are voluntarily entered into where the government has no role really adjudicating. The hairstyles of a St John's College student comes to mind. Arguably, using human rights law to decide private disputes on such matters effectively goes to the point of trivialising the human right of freedom of expression. A school has a reasonable right to be able to turn around and say, if you wish to come to our school, these are the standards by which you meet. Stating these worthy societal goals are not human rights does not, of course, mean that they are unimportant, but it does mean they should not immediately be given the same status when weighing competing priorities. The point of human rights is they are supposed to be sacrosanct, not just aspirations. When everything is a human right, nothing is. More importantly, when traditional human rights are compromised, so is the freedoms that everybody enjoys. That is why we should reassert the forgotten freedoms. Thank you very much.